I do not like her.
She is not what we expected.
You have heard of queens who lost their heads on cold mornings beneath the tower's shadow, for of royal women dragged from velvet chambers to wooden scaffolds while crowds held their breath and drums beat like distant thunder. But there was another kind of death in Tudor England. A quieter, and perhaps more terrifying death. The death of reputation, dignity, and worth, carried out not by the axe but by whispers, by letters, by physicians' reports, and by a king whose body was rotting from within even as his crown still glittered. This story begins in the winter of the year 1539, when a 24-year-old woman named Anne of Cleves left the safe, formal court of her brother Duke Wilhelm, and crossed the sea to England, believing she would become the saviour of a nation and the wife of a king. She brought with her trunks heavy with tapestries and jewels, the crests of her German house stitched in gold, the prayers of her family folded between linens, and a heart full of duty. For this marriage was no mere romance, but the keystone of a fragile Protestant alliance in a Europe trembling on the brink of war.
The Queen's grand procession approached the castle gates.
The Queen's grand procession approached the castle gates.
England at that moment was isolated, cut adrift from the Catholic powers after Henry VIII's break with Rome. France and the Holy Roman Empire had reconciled their old quarrels, leaving the island kingdom vulnerable to invasion, and the Duke of Cleves represented one of the few Protestant rulers whose friendship could shield Henry from disaster. Yet beneath the grand diplomacy of statesmen and theologians, another drama was playing out. A drama written not in treaties but in the flesh and vanity of a middle-aged king. Once Henry had been the golden prince of Europe, tall, athletic, and virile, dazzling ambassadors with tournaments and pageants. But by the end of his fourth decade, he had become a bloated, diseased tyrant whose ulcerated legs leaked pus and blood, whose breath carried the stench of decay, and whose eyes were clouded by opiates prescribed by frightened physicians, who dared not name the infection eating through his bones. He could no longer mount a horse without mechanical devices and attendants to lift him. He demanded constant proof of his masculinity, even as his body betrayed him. And into this theatre of denial and pain stepped Anne of Cleves, chosen not for her beauty, but for her brother's armies and his Protestant faith, yet condemned in advance, because no mortal woman could satisfy a fantasy born of political desperation and fading virility. Before she ever set foot on English soil, the stage for her humiliation had been built. Hans Holbein's portrait had shown her serene and dignified beneath an elaborate German headdress, a face pleasant and composed. But Henry, intoxicated by flattery and his own hunger for validation, had turned the portrait into a promise of desire and delight. He studied it obsessively, weaving daydreams of a bride who would restore his youth and reassure his crumbling ego. When Anne landed at Deal and travelled to Rochester, she was stepping into a script already written by the king's expectations. In a gesture borrowed from the romances of chivalry, Henry disguised himself as a humble messenger and burst into her chamber, expecting a gasp of recognition, a swoon of passion, the kind of theatrical submission that his courtiers had long ago learned to perform for him. What he met instead was a polite young woman raised in a formal German court, trained to bow, to speak carefully, to show modesty. She did not recognize him. She did not swoon. She simply greeted the intruder with courteous confusion. Witnesses later remembered how his face darkened, his jaw clenched, his body stiffened as if struck. In that instant, political necessity collided with personal pride, and pride began to win. The wedding could not be stopped. The alliance with Cleves was too valuable. On the 6th of January in the year 1540, the ceremony took place in Westminster Abbey, a spectacle of cloth of gold and painted fans. But beneath the music and incense, the mood was like a funeral masquerading as a festival. Henry stood resplendent in his robes, while his courtiers exchanged glances, their jewelled hands hiding whispers behind perfumed handkerchiefs. Anne, magnificent in her bridal gown, held herself with the dignity drilled into her since childhood. But she could not have imagined the depths of cruelty awaiting her. That night, the royal bedchamber became a theatre of shame. Henry, whose body now resembled more a walking corpse than a virile king, approached the marriage bed with all the enthusiasm of a condemned man approaching the block. His leg ulcers seeped through bandages into silk sheets. He blamed Anne for his own physical revulsion. In the twisted logic of Tudor England, the king's failure became the queen's fault. From that first night, a campaign began, calculated and relentless. Henry complained to his physicians about Anne's body. He invented stories about her smell, her skin, her foreign ways. Courtiers who had once bowed low for her favor now mocked her accent, her clothes, her perfumes. Ladies in waiting reported every detail to the king. Physicians examined her for defects he claimed to perceive. The very people who should have protected her became instruments of her degradation. Within weeks, she had been transformed from Queen of England into a living symbol of everything wrong with foreign influence. A scapegoat for a king's impotence and a court's cruelty. Yet this is also the story of how she survived. Where Catherine of Aragon fought and was exiled. Where Anne Boleyn defied and was beheaded. Anne of Cleves calculated. She saw the cage for what it was and chose life over pride. Silence over confrontation. When parliamentary commissioners arrived to discuss the end of her marriage, she understood exactly what was on offer. Her dignity in exchange for her survival. She agreed. She smiled. She signed. In return, she received estates, income, and a new title. The king's sister, which freed her from Henry's physical presence and the deadly intrigues of court life. It was humiliation. But it was also liberation. While Henry turned his predatory attention to Catherine Howard, Anne quietly built a household at Richmond Palace, managed her lands with intelligence, cultivated relationships with merchants and reformers, and created a network of support that would outlast the king himself. This first chapter of her story ends not with a scaffold, but with a signature. On the 9th of July in the year 1540, Parliament annulled the marriage. That same day, Thomas Cromwell, the minister who had arranged it, was executed on Tower Hill, a scapegoat for the king's embarrassment. The woman lived, the man died, and Henry married his teenage obsession before the blood on Cromwell's neck was dry. Anne of Cleves had been stripped of her crown, but she had kept her head. She had begun the slow work of transforming humiliation into survival. In a court that devoured women for breakfast, she had discovered the secret that would carry her through the reign of Henry, through the brief rule of Edward VI, and into the early years of Mary, to be present but invisible, to endure without breaking, to trade the illusion of power for the reality of freedom. It is this paradox that makes her story so compelling and so unsettling. The woman who arrived as a diplomatic bride became the mirror of a king's decay. The Queen Henry refused to touch, became the only one who outlived him. And in that survival lies a different kind of victory. The kind that whispers instead of shouts. The kind that still reaches us across 5 centuries as a warning and a promise. This is Anne of Cleves. The rotting queen he blamed for his own rot. The ghost of a marriage that revealed the truth about the most dangerous man in England. The story begins here, but it will not end until you have followed her all the way from humiliation to freedom. From the wedding that felt like a funeral to the deathbed that finally offered her peace. The portrait was meant to be a promise, not a trap. When Hans Holbein unfolded his canvas before the king in the autumn of the year 1539, what Henry saw was not a human being, but a projection of his own desperation. A delicate blend of diplomacy and fantasy painted in oil. Holbein had captured Anne of Cleves exactly as she appeared. Upright and serene. The lines of her face softened by the heavy folds of her German headdress. Her eyes calm but not coy. Her hands clasped in a gesture of discipline rather than seduction. To the modern eye, it is a pleasant likeness. An honest depiction of a young woman raised in a formal court. But to a king who had lost his youth, his allies, and his self-belief, it was the last hope of redemption. Henry stared at the painting with a hunger that went far beyond marriage. He imagined a bride who would reignite his body, an alliance that would soothe his isolation, a face that would restore his sense of masculine invincibility. Courtiers encouraged this delusion, whispering praises of the German Duchess, praising her virtues, her piety, her supposed beauty. Each flattery, another brushstroke in a portrait, already taking shape inside the king's mind. But the man who studied the portrait was no longer the golden prince who had once danced and jousted under banners of silver and azure. By the end of his 4th decade, Henry was heavy with disease, chronic ulcers in his legs, now almost certainly caused by osteomyelitis, produced foul-smelling pus that soaked through linen and silk alike, filling his chambers with a smell that perfumed handkerchiefs could not mask. Pain and opiates dulled his judgment. Circulation problems and hormonal imbalances quietly eroded his physical capacities, especially in the intimate sphere he so publicly prized. Yet his ego, inflated by decades of absolute power, would not allow a confession of weakness. He would not say he was ill. He would not say he was impotent. He would not say his body had betrayed him. Instead, he blamed the world around him, especially women, transforming his medical limitations into moral indictments of feminine inadequacy. The stage for Anne's downfall was not a chance misstep, but a psychological pattern already well established. When Anne began her journey to England, she did so with hope, not fear. She was 24, educated in courtly graces, aware of her role as a political bridge, but also quietly excited at the idea of becoming Queen of England. She had studied English customs, learned the language, practiced new dance steps, and prepared ceremonial gifts of Germanic tapestries and jewelry that spoke of her family's wealth and her brother Duke Wilhelm's power among the Lutheran princes. The winds of the Channel were bitter, but she travelled as an honoured bride, carrying the promise of an alliance that could hold Europe in balance. She could not know that she was already walking into a myth. The first encounter at Rochester would shatter all illusions, in a gesture that might have delighted a courtly lady raised on Arthurian romances. Henry disguised himself as a messenger, believing his ruffian-ready entrance would overwhelm Anne with passionate recognition. But the Duchess of Cleves had been raised in a very different tradition. German courts valued formality, composure, and restraint. She did not recognize the overweight stranger bursting into her chamber. She did not swoon. She bowed politely. She offered a few words of courtesy. That was all. Witnesses recalled how the king's face changed, darkening with something deeper than disappointment, a kind of panic wrapped in anger, as if the careful fiction of his invincible desirability had been pierced by a needle. In that moment, political necessity collided with personal pride, and pride emerged victorious. The woman standing before him became not a partner, but an obstacle. Not a bride, but a threat to his self-image. Yet the machinery of state could not be stopped. The wedding went forward on the 6th of January in the year 1540, a pageant of gold cloth and incense. But beneath the splendour lay a mood like a funeral, dressed as a festival. Foreign diplomats strained to read the king's expression. Courtiers whispered behind jewelled hands. Anne held herself with dignity, unaware of the subtle signals rippling through Westminster's ancient stones, signals that her new husband was already plotting her undoing. This was not a celebration of love or even of alliance. It was the opening scene of a public humiliation that would take months to play out and leave scars that lasted decades. That night in the royal bedchamber, the performance of rejection began. Henry, whose body had become more corpse than king, approached the marriage bed with the resignation of a man heading for his own execution. His bandaged legs leaked onto the sheets. His heart raced with fever. His hands trembled with rage and shame. Instead of looking inward at his own decay, he turned outward, blaming the young woman beside him for his revulsion. In the twisted logic of Tudor masculinity, the king could not fail, only the queen could. Thus, Anne's body became the scapegoat for Henry's impotence. He whispered to his physicians that she smelled wrong, that she was deformed, that her foreign ways had corrupted his natural potency. Courtiers who wanted to please the king repeated these lies, turning private insults into public gossip, transforming a dignified woman into a spectacle of ridicule. Within weeks of the wedding, the campaign had taken full shape. Courtiers who had once competed for Anne's favour now mocked her German accent, her unfamiliarity with English customs, even her choice of perfumes. Ladies in waiting, meant to be companions and confidants, acted as spies and saboteurs, reporting every imagined flaw to Henry's eager ears. Physicians were summoned to examine her body for evidence of defects. Their findings twisted into further justification for annulment. Pamphlets circulated suggesting that Germanic women were inherently unsuitable for English men. Poets composed verses celebrating the superiority of native-born beauties. These were not spontaneous expressions of xenophobia, but calculated acts of political theatre, designed to validate Henry's rejection. Anne's humiliation became a form of entertainment for a court that thrived on the misfortune of others. Even more degrading were the private torments disguised as medical necessity. Royal physicians and ladies-in-waiting subjected Anne to intimate examinations, searching for proof of the defects Henry claimed. These reports, carefully crafted to support the king's narrative, would be preserved in royal archives as evidence of her unfitness for generations of historians to misinterpret. Professional knowledge bowed before political necessity, and the dignity of an innocent woman became a footnote in a story written by male vanity. But even as this storm gathered, Anne of Cleves began to reveal the qualities that would save her. Beneath her calm exterior, she was taking the measure of the court, noting who could be trusted, who carried tales, who offered sympathy, and who might be quietly cultivating ties with her brother and the Protestant cause. The very discipline that had seemed so foreign at first now became her armour. She endured humiliation with silent grace, neither lashing out like Catherine of Aragon, nor scheming like Anne Boleyn, but observing, calculating, and preparing for the moment when endurance would matter more than pride. Henry, meanwhile, had already shifted his predatory gaze. Before the annulment process had even begun, he was pursuing Catherine Howard, a teenage girl whose youth promised the validation his ego required. The contrast between the mature foreign queen and the inexperienced English girl became a weapon Henry used against Anne's dignity. Court observers noted how his demeanour brightened whenever Catherine appeared. While his interactions with Anne grew perfunctory and cold, the message was unmistakable. The marriage was a formality. The Queen was an obstacle. The King had found his next victim. Foreign ambassadors watched these developments with fascination and horror. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles used Anne's humiliation as evidence of English barbarism in his diplomatic correspondence. French courtiers staged entertainments, mocking Henry's inability to consummate his marriage with a decent German virgin. The Protestant states viewed Anne's rejection as a personal insult, threatening the entire Reformation cause. Duke Wilhelm considered breaking his alliance with England and joining the Catholic League, a move that would have left Henry isolated and perhaps invited invasion. Only Anne's own letters urging patience and restraint prevented this catastrophic realignment of power. By the spring of the year 1540, Anne had been transformed from a diplomatic asset into a political liability, from queen into scapegoat, from wife into the other. Yet she was already laying the groundwork for survival. Quietly, she cultivated relationships with German merchants in London, Protestant reformers, and English nobles who viewed Henry's treatment of her as symptomatic of a deeper instability in royal policy. These networks provided her with information, protection, and financial opportunities that would later supplement her official income from the crown. Her household at Richmond Palace began to take shape as an unofficial embassy for German nationals, a sanctuary for scholars and merchants vulnerable in Henry's increasingly xenophobic kingdom. The irony of this period is stark. The woman presented in propaganda as a foreign contaminant was in reality building bridges between England and the very states Henry needed. While his vanity destroyed alliances, her discretion maintained them. While his body rotted, she adapted. While his court mocked her, she built a base of quiet power outside their notice. And in the coming months, as the annulment process ground forward with its legal fictions and theological justifications, she would make the decision that sealed her fate, but also secured her life to accept humiliation as a strategy, to sign away her crown in exchange for freedom, to survive where others had perished. This was the world of the portrait and the corpse, a king clinging to a painted fantasy even as his flesh decayed, a queen reduced to an icon of inadequacy even as she laid the foundations of independence, a court that whispered about smells and shapes even as it ignored the stench of its own corruption. In Tudor, England appearances were not just masks, but weapons. And Anne of Cleves had been handed a weapon disguised as a likeness. She could not destroy the portrait. She could not heal the king, but she could endure the theatre he built around her and walk out of it alive. And that, in the deadly labyrinth of Henry's reign, was a victory more radical than defiance. As spring turned to summer in the year 1540, the annulment machinery began its slow, inevitable grind. The same ministers who had praised the marriage now searched canon law for impediments. Bishops who had celebrated Anne's Protestant faith now discovered defects in her Germanic religious practices. Scholars who had hailed the wisdom of the Cleves alliance now wrote tracts against international marriages. Each reversal another performance of loyalty to a king whose ego required sacrifice. The outcome was already decided. All that remained was the theatre of law, the dance of testimony, the signing of papers, and Anne, watching with cool eyes, understood that she had only one weapon left: submission. This is where part 2 rests. On the edge of that decision, with the portrait hanging in the royal gallery like a ghost of promises broken, and the king's body festering beneath layers of silk, the Queen stands at a window in Richmond, hands clasped, watching the gardens bloom. She is no longer the hopeful bride who crossed the channel. She is becoming something else. A figure of survival, a master of invisibility, a woman who will outlive them all. The portrait may have sealed her fate, but the corpse it reflected was not hers. It was his. The royal bedchamber had seen passion, betrayal, grief, and death, but never before had it witnessed such silence. On the night of January 6th, in the year 1540, Anne of Cleves entered the chamber as Queen of England, dressed in soft linen and pearls, her hair braided neatly beneath her veil, her hands trembling only slightly with the weight of what she believed to be duty. She had fulfilled every expectation set before her. She had stood beside the king at the altar with poise and grace. She had smiled before the watchful eyes of diplomats. She had bowed to the English nobles with humility. Now, she waited for her husband, not as a stranger, but as a bride to seal the union in the sacred privacy of their shared bed. But what came through the door was not a man. It was a shadow of power, a husk of once glorious flesh, wrapped in embroidered silk and cloaked in anger. Henry VIII entered the room with the expression of a man walking into judgment. His eyes narrowed, his mouth twisted with a kind of revulsion that had nothing to do with the woman before him and everything to do with the body he could no longer command. Beneath his golden robes, his legs were wrapped in bandages, soaked with pus from open ulcers that refused to heal. The smell of rot entered the room before he did, muffled only by lavender-scented handkerchiefs, clutched by attendants who knew better than to breathe too deeply. His breath was shallow, tinged with wine and medicine, his hands swollen from inflammation. He crossed the chamber not as a lover, but as a man trapped in a nightmare of his own, making force to perform what his body had long since forgotten how to do. Anne rose when he approached. She did not shrink. She did not complain. Her posture was perfect. She said something soft, respectful, a gesture of welcome. But Henry could not see her. He saw instead the end of his illusion. The portrait had lied, or rather, it had told the truth too plainly. Anne was not seductive. She was not English. She was not the balm to his festering pride. She was real, and reality had become unbearable. What followed was not consummation, but accusation. In the early hours of morning, Henry left the chamber in silence. He summoned no witnesses. He offered no words to his bride. The marriage, in his mind, there was already void, because his body had failed to respond, and someone had to carry the blame. That someone would be Anne. In the days that followed, the court became a stage, and the Queen became its most unwilling actress. Henry began speaking in riddles to his courtiers, muttering that his bride was not as she had been described, that her body was unappealing, that her breath was foul, that he had felt no stirring in his loins, that she was, in his words, nothing so fair as she had been reported. It was not an open declaration, but the beginning of a smear campaign that would slowly, deliberately, reduce Anne from queen to embarrassment. Physicians were called in to examine the king, not to heal him, for that was no longer possible, but to produce language that could transfer his failures to another. They whispered about humours, about the influence of foreign diets, about how Anne's Germanic constitution might have disturbed the king's natural balance. Some claimed that she carried chilling airs from the continent that rendered English men sterile. Others hinted at witchcraft, and though none of it made sense, all of it was recorded, repeated, and believed. Anne, meanwhile, continued to perform her role. She attended court. She greeted ambassadors. She answered politely when addressed. But the glances had changed. The laughter was sharper. The women around her, once companions, now informants, reported her expressions, her meals, even the scent of her garments to the king's spies. In Tudor England, a queen did not need to sin to fall. She only needed to be inconvenient. The real torment, however, was not public. It took place behind closed doors, disguised as concern. Royal physicians, on orders from the king, subjected Anne to repeated examinations to determine whether she was physically capable of consummation. These were not gentle inquiries. They were humiliating, intrusive, and designed not to help her, but to support the fiction that Henry could not, or would not admit, that the failure of the marriage lay not in her body, but in his own. Reports from these examinations, written with the language of medicine but dripping with politics, painted Anne as intact, unawakened, unripe, words carefully chosen to justify annulment, words that would echo through history and distort her legacy for centuries. She had done nothing, and yet everything about her, the shape of her hands, the curve of her mouth, the way she walked or stood or remained silent, was reinterpreted as evidence of unworthiness. Still, she endured. When questioned, she denied nothing. She did not protest the examinations. She made no public plea. Some mistook this for ignorance, others for shame, but Anne's silence was not submission. It was survival. She had seen what happened to women who resisted Henry's narrative. Catherine of Aragon had been exiled and kept from her child until death. Anne Boleyn had been accused of crimes no man believed and beheaded within days. Jane Seymour had died in childbed, praised by the king only because she had delivered him a son. And now, Anne of Cleves, fourth in the line of wives, faced a different kind of execution, the erasure of her dignity. At the same time, the king's eyes were drifting toward youth. Catherine Howard, barely out of girlhood, danced through court with laughter and lightness. Everything Anne was not. She was English, flirtatious, and eager to please. Henry's mood improved in her presence. His courtiers, ever watchful, began to shift their allegiances accordingly. Jokes were told behind closed doors. Songs were composed that hinted at a change to come. Anne was still queen, but only in name. And then the process began. By spring, legal scholars were scouring canon law for precedents to dissolve the marriage. Theologians debated points of doctrine. Bishops, who had once celebrated the union, now found reasons to condemn it. Witnesses were summoned not to offer truth, but to say what was necessary. The phrase non-consummation became the banner under which the entire process marched. Anne was approached by commissioners. She listened. She asked questions. And when the terms were presented annulment in exchange for safety, lands, income, and the title of king's sister, she made her choice. Not out of weakness, not out of fear, but because she understood something Henry never did that to survive in Tudor England. One did not need to be loved, or even respected. One only needed to remain standing. On July 9th, in the year 1540, Parliament declared the marriage invalid. Henry, by then, had already begun planning his wedding to Catherine Howard. Anne, having agreed to the annulment, was rewarded with Richmond Palace and several other estates. Making her one of the wealthiest women in England, she received an income larger than most duchesses. She retained ceremonial precedence over nearly all noble women, and most importantly, she kept her life. That night, while the court prepared for another round of celebrations, Anne sat alone in her new residence, no longer queen, no longer wife. She was now something more elusive, a free woman in a world where women were rarely free. The marriage that had begun with silk and gold had ended with parchment and wax. No heads had fallen, no swords had been drawn, and yet the wound to her dignity was deep. But she would heal, quietly, strategically. She would turn that pain into purpose. In time, the court would forget the woman who failed to enchant the king, but history, true history, would remember her differently, as the queen who was never touched, but never broken. And in the palace gardens, to where summer unfolded, Anne of Cleves walked alone beneath the oaks, and the sun, each step no longer dictated by royal command, each breath no longer tainted by fear. The marriage had ended. Her story had only begun. The annulment had been signed, the crown had been set down, and yet Anne of Cleves remained not vanished, not exiled, not disgraced in the way her predecessors had been, but left standing at the edge of the Tudor world like a monument to quiet survival. She was no longer queen, no longer the woman meant to carry the Protestant hopes of Northern Europe, but something far stranger, the former wife of a living king. She bore no child, she carried no guilt, and she wore no widow's veil. And because no one could quite say what she was, everyone around her began to invent what they needed her to be. It began with the word virgin. In Tudor England, the concept of virginity was more than a physical state. It was a political weapon, a badge of honor, or a mark of suspicion depending on who wielded it. For Anne, it became both her shield and her shame. To justify the annulment, Henry's ministers had declared the marriage never consummated. Anne had confirmed this herself, publicly stating she remained untouched, and thus freeing the king from marital obligation. But in the weeks that followed, that very claim which had protected her life began to twist into something cruel. Court gossip, already sharpened by months of humiliation, turned its attention to Anne's body with a new kind of fervor. Some whispered she had lied, that she had seduced the king and failed to satisfy him. Others said she had told the truth, but that her very virginity was unnatural, cold, uninviting a woman, incapable of rousing a man. Physicians had examined her and found no flaw, yet that only deepened the court's hunger for speculation. If the fault was not physical, then it must be something worse. A defect of soul, of temperament, of feminine instinct. The same courtiers who once competed for her favor now made sport of her dignity, their barbed tongues dressed in silk. And Anne, ever composed, endured it all without a public word. She appeared at banquets when invited, standing a few paces behind the king and his new teenage bride, Catherine Howard. She smiled when addressed. She curtsied when required. But the contrast between her and Catherine could not have been more brutal. Where Anne was reserved, Catherine was radiant. Where Anne moved with solemn grace, Catherine laughed and danced and spun through the court like sunlight. She was barely 16, young enough to be Anne's niece and Henry, who had long since surrendered his body to decay, gazed at her with the helpless obsession of a man chasing the shadow of his former self. The comparison was not subtle. The king made it clear in both word and gesture that Catherine represented everything Anne was not. He called her his rose without a thorn, paraded her in public with theatrical affection, and bestowed gifts upon her that far surpassed anything Anne had received. Even at court gatherings where Anne was present, he spoke of Catherine's beauty, her sweetness, to her youth, all within earshot of the woman who had been queen only weeks before. These were not accidents. They were performances, and the court, as always, followed his cue. Anne found herself seated farther from the dais, placed beside lower-ranking nobles, passed over for dances, ignored in toasts. Her presence was tolerated, but never welcomed. Her title of king's sister sounded grand, but in practice, it left her socially isolated, too high to mingle with unmarried women, too low to stand beside the queen. She existed in a liminal space, a ghost haunting the very court that had once celebrated her arrival. Worse still, her own body continued to be the subject of discussion. At royal feasts, nobles would speak in half-sentences about German women being too tall, too stern, too cold in the bed. At hunts, the younger men would joke about Henry's failed wedding night, miming gestures that sent bursts of cruel laughter through the forest paths. Even Anne's servants began to receive questions disguised as idle curiosity about her habits, her scent, her expressions. When alone, the walls of Richmond and Chelsea were not thick enough to keep out such poison. But Anne was not ignorant, nor was she passive. Though she said nothing publicly, she began to solidify her inner circle. German merchants who had watched her humiliation with horror now found themselves quietly favoured in court dealings. Protestant scholars received letters and gifts from her household, thanking them for their support. A network of allies, subtle and loyal, began to emerge, one not built on power, but on gratitude and trust. Anne's household became a haven for those displaced by England's shifting religious tides. She funded the translation of theological texts. She paid for the schooling of Protestant children. She corresponded with bishops and reformers abroad. Always careful, always neutral, but never idle. While Henry paraded his new wife through the palaces, Anne retreated into something deeper, the slow, deliberate construction of a life beyond the crown. She began studying English law, managing her own estates with such attention that even the king's treasurers spoke of her efficiency. Her gardens flourished, her household grew, her bookshelves swelled with volumes in Latin, German, and English. She commissioned artworks, some devotional, some secular. Her days were filled not with mourning, but with building not the life she had expected, but one she would shape with her own hands. Still, the court would not let her go. She was summoned to events when needed, paraded for foreign visitors, as a sign of Henry's magnanimity. "See how well we treat our former queens," they would say. "She is happy. She is honoured." And Anne would smile, always smile, and nod as if all of it were true. But beneath the surface, she remained vigilant. She knew how quickly favour could sour, how easily a misplaced word or misunderstood gesture could turn her name from tolerated to traitorous. There were moments when the strain showed when her eyes lingered too long on Catherine's youthful glow, or when her hand tensed during court rituals. But these were fleeting. Anne had learned the most dangerous lesson of all in a world ruled by whim and rot. Stillness was power. Ironically, it was Catherine Howard, the girl who had once been the blade held to Anne's throat, who would soon fall victim to the same machine that had nearly destroyed her. But Anne did not know that yet. For now, she watched, and waited, and endured. By the close of the year, 1540, Anne had outlived the scandal. The court had moved on, as it always did, from one spectacle to the next. Henry had grown bored, as he always did, when desire dulled into routine, and Anne remained not as a queen, not as a wife, but as something rarer, a woman no longer afraid. She had been stripped of her crown, examined like an animal, mocked by nobles, and cast aside for a child, and yet she stood, alive, respected in silence, and slowly building a life that would in time outlast all those who had once called her a failure. The vultures had circled, the court had hissed, the king had withdrawn, but the Virgin still stood, and that, in Tudor England, was a miracle. There is a kind of strength that is not loud. It does not shout in courtrooms or bleed on battlefields. It moves quietly, like ink through parchment or a ripple beneath still water. In Tudor England, that kind of strength rarely survived long. But Anne of Cleves' disgraced bride, discarded queen, foreigner in a world of sharpened smiles, understood it better than most. And because of that, she lived. By the summer of the year, 1540, the decision had already been made. Parliament had debated. Canon lawyers had written their opinions. The physicians had murmured their findings, and the bishops had begun to shift their loyalties like sails in uncertain wind. The King of England no longer wanted a German queen. He had grown enamored with a girl half her age, with dimples in her cheeks and a giggle that floated through the halls like perfume. Catherine Howard now danced in every corridor of Henry's imagination, and Anne had become nothing more than a legal inconvenience, a blemish to be erased, a mistake to be filed away. But the mistake, as it turned out, was not Anne. She was summoned to Richmond, not under threat, not in chains, but with the kind of chilling formality that said, "Your presence is required for the end of your own story." She arrived with composure, dressed in dark green velvet that whispered dignity, her headdress folded back to show the strength in her gaze. She met the commissioners not with weeping nor with rage, but with a calm curiosity. She asked questions. She requested to see the documents, and when they placed before her the proposed terms of annulment already signed, he already sealed, she studied them with the poise of a woman who had already made peace with loss. The conditions were, in truth, astonishing. She would be granted several manors, including Richmond Palace and Bletchingley. Her annual income would exceed that of many English dukes. She would retain precedence in court above all women, except the Queen and the King's daughters. She would be known not as the divorced wife, not as the failed queen, but as the King's sister, an invented title, ceremonial and safe, granting her visibility without influence. She would be invited to court functions, addressed with honor, provided a household and staff of her choosing, and most importantly, spared from disgrace. In exchange, she would acknowledge that the marriage had never been consummated, that she remained a virgin, that the king had acted in accordance with law and godly conscience, that she harbored no resentment, that she would remain in England as a loyal subject, not a foreign princess. It was a surrender, and it was brilliant. Enesina, not with trembling hand, not with the bitterness of a woman scorned, but with a clarity born of survival. She had watched the fates of the others. Catherine of Aragon had clung to her crown and died in exile. Separated from her daughter, Anne Boleyn had challenged the king's affections and lost her head. Even Jane Seymour, beloved in death, had been broken by childbirth before the crown could weigh fully on her brow. Anne of Cleves had chosen not to fight for power, not to claw for love, but to walk away quietly, still breathing. In the eyes of many, that made her weak, but history would prove otherwise. The days that followed were filled with ceremony, not the ceremony of coronations or royal weddings, but a softer, stranger theatre designed to mask brutality beneath velvet and lace. Anne received the visits of nobles who praised her wisdom in yielding. Foreign ambassadors sent word of admiration cloaked in condolences. Even Henry, in a gesture of theatrical gallantry, wrote her a letter thanking her for her sweet and conformable disposition. Behind each polite phrase was a simple truth. Anne had saved them all from scandal, and they knew it. She moved to Richmond Palace shortly thereafter. The rooms were airy, the gardens vast, and for the first time since setting foot in England, Anne found silence. Not the silence of humiliation, but of safety. There were no ladies in waiting whispering behind fans, no courtiers studying her face for flaws, no royal physicians waiting to undress her with clinical hands. In Richmond, she could think, could breathe, could be, and so she began to live. She kept a small household efficient, loyal, and largely German in composition. She studied English law. She oversaw the running of her estates with a precision that astonished royal treasurers. She hired tutors to improve her language, her music, her knowledge of English theology. She planted orchards. She corresponded with scholars. She walked each morning through her gardens in silence, sometimes humming the songs of her childhood. And slowly, the wound began to heal. But Anne was no fool. She did not allow herself to forget the court entirely. She attended royal events when invited, arriving in carriages with polished wheels and liveried guards. She presented gifts to the king's children, small, tasteful tokens, chosen with care. She danced when expected, laughed when appropriate, bowed when summoned. But she never again sought influence. She never again leaned too close to the fire. She knew what it could do, and it was perhaps that restraint that preserved her. As one by one, the others fell. Catherine Howard, the rose without a thorn, would be beheaded within 18 months. The girl whose smile had been used as Anne's humiliation would find herself accused, imprisoned, and destroyed, just as Anne had foreseen. And Henry, too heavier now, slower, more consumed by pain and paranoia, would soon begin to crumble beneath the weight of his own rage. His flesh continued to rot. His mind grew dim. His wives became shadows, their faces lost in the corridors of his memory. But Anne remained. In time, the gossip stopped. The jokes faded. New scandals came to occupy the minds of nobles. Wars, marriages, inheritances, executions. The woman once called the Mare of Flanders was now called something else behind closed doors wise. Her estates flourished. She invested in agriculture, implementing German techniques that increased yield, and hired local farmers. Her account books, preserved to this day, show a woman who understood commerce, property, and investment better than many men of her time. Her servants spoke of her fairness. Her tenants praised her generosity. She funded schools. She sponsored Protestant writings. She provided quiet refuge to women cast off by court scandals. And never once, in the decades that followed, did she speak ill of the king. Perhaps she pitied him. Perhaps she feared him still. Or perhaps she knew that to mention him was to give him power over her story again. And she had claimed that story, now written it not with crowns or lovers or heirs, but with patience, caution, and time. When Henry finally died in the year 1547, bloated and groaning in his bed, Anne was the only one of his wives still alive. The others had perished by childbirth, by politics, by steel, but she had outlived them all. Without children, Without scandal, without a crown, only her name. And her peace. In the end, the surrender had saved her life. But it had done more than that. It had given her a life that was her own. In a world where women were measured by the men who claimed them wives by husbands, mothers by sons, queens by kings, Anne of Cleves became something else entirely. She became the sister, not by blood, not by affection, but by royal invention, a title crafted to soothe embarrassment, to preserve appearances, and above all, to remove her from the language of desire. She was no longer the wife who had failed. She was now the king's sister, a term wrapped in courtesy and silk, but hollow at its core. It granted her ceremonial status, gave her precedence over every woman in England save the Queen and the King's daughters, yet denied her access to any real power. And for Anne, that was perfect. The court did not know what to do with her. In a realm built on hierarchy, where every seat, glance, and whisper followed a strict choreography, Anne of Cleves became a living anomaly, too important to ignore, too irrelevant to fear, too foreign to love, and too alive to forget. She occupied her role like a shadow along the wall present, dignified, but unintrusive. When she was summoned to court festivals or diplomatic receptions, she arrived promptly, draped in dark silks, never the brightest jewel in the room, but always polished, always composed. She greeted foreign envoys in fluent English, dined without excess, spoke when asked, smiled when observed, and returned to Richmond before anyone had the chance to draw her into courtly intrigue. And yet, in that stillness, she learned everything. Her new life was quieter. Yes, but not idle. With the crown no longer pressed upon her brow, she turned her attention inward, first to her household, then to her lands, and finally to the world that stretched beyond the court's narrow gaze. Richmond Palace, once merely her place of exile, became a sanctuary and a laboratory. She redesigned her gardens, introducing German horticultural techniques that flourished in English soil. She supervised the restoration of her manors, implemented fair taxation among her tenants, and insisted on proper schooling for the children in surrounding villages. Her rooms were filled not with courtiers, but with scholars, musicians, and artisans, many of them Protestant exiles or continental thinkers, seeking shelter in a land still caught between faiths. Anne welcomed them not as a queen, but as a patron, protector, and quiet observer of a changing world. Her household became, in all but name, a small independent court, one ruled not by fear or vanity, but by competence and curiosity. She read constantly. She studied law, property rights, scripture. She learned how to write in the formal English hand, how to manage ledgers, how to speak with merchants about trade routes and wool prices. She kept careful accounts, paid her staff fairly, and refused to indulge in the excesses that had bankrupted so many noble families. Her estate books still survive in English archives, clean, legible, methodical, filled with notes in her own hand. No idle woman left those margins. But even as she cultivated this life of substance, Anne remained fully aware of the court she had once been part of. She had not forgotten the sharp eyes, the painted flattery, the hands that clasped too tightly, the smiles that hid blades. She returned only when necessary, and when she did, she moved through Whitehall and Hampton Court with a kind of elegant invisibility. She curtsied deeply to Henry's new wife, Catherine Parr, and exchanged pleasantries with his daughters, the Lady Mary and the Lady Elizabeth, both of whom regarded her with more warmth than the court expected. Anne did not try to befriend the new queen. She had no desire to repeat the performance. Instead, she remained loyal to her invented title. performing sisterhood with just enough grace to be admired, but never enough to be feared. And so, she endured, as Henry's health declined further, his limbs swelling, his ulcers weeping, his mood souring. Anne faded further into the background. While others jockeyed for influence, she maintained her distance. While ambitious families fought over succession, she hosted poetry readings in her garden. When spies circled the court, she opened her kitchens to feed the poor. And when Catherine Howard was arrested, humiliated, and beheaded just 18 months after the annulment, Anne neither gloated nor mourned. She sent no letters, made no public statement, but her silence was thunderous. The girl who had once danced in front of Anne as a symbol of everything she was not, had fallen into the same trap that Anne had so carefully sidestepped. And still, Anne remained. Over time, her reputation began to shift. The gossip faded. The jokes about her body, her accent, her supposed failure in the royal bed grew stale and were eventually replaced by tales of her wisdom, her good governance, her charity. Ambassadors visiting England often requested to meet her not out of curiosity, but out of genuine respect. She offered them calm, reasoned perspectives on English politics. She listened. She asked intelligent questions. She never gave too much. They left with the impression that beneath her simplicity lay a deeply astute mind, one shaped not by courts, but by experience. Among the people of England, too, her image changed. The women in her villages called her Lady Anne with affection. Children in the parishes near her estates were taught to read in schools she had funded. Merchants spoke of her fairness in trade. Her name was not linked to scandal, nor death, nor disgrace, but to competence, to balance, to peace. And in a time where queens were often reduced to corpses or cautionary tales, Anne of Cleves became something else entirely, a model of how to survive. She wrote letters, often some in English, others in German. Many were to her brother Wilhelm, keeping him informed of her safety and of English politics. Some were to Lutheran reformers. Others were to women widows, abbesses, female scholars. Her words were thoughtful, often practical, sometimes quietly humorous. She signed them simply Anna, the sister of the king. When Henry died in the year 1547, bloated and broken, surrounded by priests he had once denounced, Anne did not attend the final deathbed procession. She did not need to. She had already outlived him, not just in years, but in legacy. Of all his wives, she alone remained standing. Catherine of Aragon had died in exile. Anne Boleyn had died in blood. Jane Seymour had died in childbirth. Catherine Howard had died in shame. Catherine Parr would live a little longer, but not much. Only Anne of Cleves would see England pass from Henry to Edward, and from Edward to Mary, and still hold her head high. She had no children, no crown, no tomb adorned with legend. But she had something none of the others had been allowed: time. Time to shape a life. Time to build a legacy. Time to fade, not in tragedy, but in triumph. And so, in the quiet halls of Richmond and Chelsea, Anne of Cleves became what no one had expected, a symbol not of scandal, but of steadiness. The sister in the shadows had become a matriarch in her own right, forgotten by some, underestimated by many, but untouched by the flames that had consumed so many others. And when history turned its pages, and the names of queens were listed, and the weight of Tudor horror was tallied, Anne's name would not rest among the fallen. It would live lightly written, softly spoken but present, a name not feared, not mourned, but quietly, undeniably respected. The Tudor court moved quickly. Its memory was short, its appetite endless, and its mercy as fleeting as candlelight in wind. But Anne of Cleves remembered everything. She remembered the day she arrived in England with braided hair and a chest full of tapestries. She remembered the first look on Henry's face when he entered her chamber in disguise, and how quickly that look turned into disappointment. Then disgust. Then silence. She remembered the taste of the feast at her wedding, the weight of her robes, the crushing stillness of that wedding night, and the sound of servants who did not speak when they undressed her. She remembered the papers, the titles, the gifts handed like chains wrapped in velvet. But more than anything, Anne remembered the faces, the women and men who smiled as the fire behind their teeth burned everything it touched. And one by one, she watched them fall. The first was Thomas Cromwell. He had built her marriage. He had praised her portrait. He had secured the alliance with Cleves, and whispered to Henry of its necessity. And when the king decided the marriage had shamed him, it was Cromwell who stood alone beneath the scaffold on Tower Hill, stripped of favour, friendless in the shadow of a monarch's wounded pride. On the very day that Anne signed the annulment, Cromwell lost his head. The ink on her surrender had not yet dried when the sword severed the neck of the man who had once stood at the heart of English power. His death was swift, but its message lingered no loyalty, no brilliance. No service could save a man once the king had turned away. Anne had not spoken to him since the weeks before the wedding. She had no means to mourn him, but in the quiet of her chamber, as servants packed her belongings for the move to Richmond, she sat by the window, and for a long time
We've done what we can, Your Grace.
said nothing. Then came Catherine Howard, the girl who danced in sunlight, who laughed with bare shoulders, who became Anne's public replacement and private humiliation. Anne has stood beside her at feasts, offering congratulations with a smile so measured it could have been sculpted from stone. She had watched the king, bloated and breathless, beam with pride beside the child bride, whose innocence became England's spectacle. She had listened as courtiers praised Catherine's sweetness, her youth, her joy, all the things Anne had been told she lacked. But joy, in Henry's court, was never safe for long. Barely 18 months after their wedding, Catherine was accused of secrets, of sin, of entertaining men in the shadows. She was dragged through corridors she had once skipped through, her pearls stripped from her neck, her laughter replaced with sobs that echoed through Whitehall like the cry of a trapped animal. In February of the year, 1542, the axe fell once more. Another queen was erased. Another love story rotted in the court's soil. Anne received the news, not with glee, but with silence. She did not celebrate. She did not condemn. Instead, she walked the long gallery of Richmond alone that evening, her hands clasped, her face unreadable. Perhaps she thought of her own wedding night, the silence, the rejection, the words left unspoken. Perhaps she thought of how easily it might have been her. After Catherine's execution, Henry aged like fruit left in sun. His flesh split. His legs refused to heal. His sleep came in fits. His breath wheezed from lungs heavy with sickness and shame. Physiciens applied poultice. Priests began to whisper of repentance. Servants wept from the smell that clung to his sheets. But still he roared when defied. Still, he held court in bursts of erratic cruelty. And still, Anne kept her distance. She was invited to court for state events. She came when called. She wore muted colours, stood in her designated place, bowed at the correct angle, and left without lingering. She never sought favour. She never asked for land. And for that, Henry came to respect her in a way he never admitted. In a court of ambition and performance, Anne's restraint had become a kind of power. The years passed. Anne outlived the memory of her marriage. She outlived the marriage that replaced hers. She watched Henry take his final wife, Catherine Parr, the widow scholar who read to the king when he could no longer read to himself. And Anne, now in her 30s, stood by and observed this final act with the patience of a woman who had stopped expecting poetry from men. In the year 1547, The king died. Henry Tudor, second of that name, once the Golden Prince. The Lion of England. Conqueror of wives. Destroyer of enemies. Restorer of crowns died, surrounded by incense and ceremony. But no love. His body, too swollen for a coffin, began to rot before the lid was closed. The tomb beneath St. George's Chapel was sealed in haste. And already, before the dirt had settled, the power struggles began again. Anne did not attend the deathbed. She was not summoned. She did not wear mourning black. She did not write letters of grief. But when the messenger arrived, bowed low, and delivered the words she had always known would come, she nodded once. Not in triumph, not in joy. In release, she had outlived him. More than that, she had outlived them all. She lived to see Edward, Henry's parlor, Protestant, crowned as a boy king. She attended his coronation in muted violet, and sat at a distance, smiling faintly as the kingdom passed into trembling hands. She lived to see Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, rise from exile to reclaim her mother's dignity. Though they shared different faiths, Anne and Mary met with mutual respect, their shared history uniting them more than theology ever could. Anne lived long enough to witness the rise of Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, another shadow, another memory, another girl shaped by Henry's hunger and cruelty. Anne watched them all. She walked the edges of their reigns like a ghost with warm hands. She advised when asked, comforted when needed, and withdrew when danger gathered like storm clouds above the throne. She kept no court. She sought no title. She wrote letters in 4 languages. She maintained friendships with women across Europe, widows, queens, chôlas, reformers. Her home became a quiet refuge for the weary and the wise. And still, she remembered. The echoes of the scaffold never quite left her. The corridor at Whitehall where she had once been examined by strangers. The silk sheets soaked in Henry's sweat. The sting of being called a disappointment by a dying man. Those things never vanished. But she learned to live around them. To build a life with silence and bread and open windows. To find freedom in the spaces between power. By the time Anne of Cleves reached her final year, 1557, she had become more legend than woman. The people near Chelsea knew her as a kind mistress, a lady of piety and good judgment. Ambassadors sent her gifts. Her name was spoken softly in noble houses, not in fear or ridicule, but with something rare in Tudor England, respect. She died quietly, in her own bed, with servants who loved her. No sword, no poison, no exile. Just breath, leaving the body as naturally as mist dissolves at dawn. She was buried in Westminster Abbey not as a queen, but as a woman who had worn the crown and laid it down, and when the nobility filed past her casket, heads bowed and faces drawn. Many of them were too young to remember the scandal that had once threatened to destroy her. All they knew was that she had lived wisely, gracefully, and long, and when the shadows of Henry's reign were counted, not just the bodies buried, but the lives broken, the hearts scorched, the crowns destroyed. There was one name that remained intact: Anne of Cleves, the woman who watched them die and never once lost herself. By the time the Tudor court learned to forget Anne of Cleves, she had already written herself into a place that memory could not touch. Not through drama, not through airs or wars or rebellions, but through something far rarer: steadiness. In an age where survival was measured in silence and women were rarely allowed to age with dignity, Anne lived long enough to become something England had not expected: a matriarch. Not a queen, not a consort, but a woman who had endured the storm and remained to witness the calm that followed. In the years after Henry's death in 1547, Anne's role shifted once again. No longer an ex-wife, no longer a symbol of scandal, but a kind of living landmark in the shifting political landscape. She became a bridge, not just between England and the Protestant states of the continent, but between past and present, She had known Henry in his youth and in his ruin. She had shared chambers with Catherine Howard and spoken with Catherine Parr. She had watched Edward VI take the throne as a fragile boy king and saw the tremble in the hands of the nobles who knelt before him. She had broken bread with Mary I. The woman who had once watched her mother die in exile. She had exchanged words with Elizabeth when she was still too young to wear a crown, but already old enough to understand the cost of power. And through it all, Anne remained untouched by the flames. She held no office. She led no faction. She made no declarations. But those who came to her chamber nobles, cholas, women in disgrace, men in doubt left with something they had not expected to find in the company of a discarded bride wisdom. Her rooms at Chelsea became a refuge for the tired and thoughtful, not a salon in the French style, not a court of influence, but a space of soft voices, warm firelight, and quiet counsel. She was not a queen, but she was listened to like one. Her friendships grew beyond blood and borders. She corresponded with the wives of German reformers, exchanged books with humanist scholars, and funded translations of theological texts that passed silently through English parishes. She supported the arts not lavishly, but intentionally offering patronage to musicians and painters whose work reflected not flattery, but faith. Her clothing was modest but elegant, combining the structure of her German roots with the delicate embroidery of English style. Her household blended both cultures seamlessly. Protestant devotions in the morning, English food on the table, German discipline in the accounting books, and English laughter in the garden. And the people noticed. Those who had once mocked her name now spoke it with affection. She became known as Lady Anne, a title stripped of royal pretense, but layered with quiet authority. Children born in her manors were christened with her blessing. Tenants petitioned her directly, knowing they would be heard. Servants stayed for years, some until their deaths, speaking of her fairness, her steadiness, her habit of rising early and walking the gardens before the sun had cleared the mist. She listened to disputes. She arranged marriages. She gave coins to widows. She made notes in the margins of the Bible she kept beside her bed. And when illness touched her household, she sat beside the sick herself, unafraid of proximity to pain. There were no more scandals, no more trials, no more letters from the king demanding obedience. Only the slow unfolding of a life finally lived on her own terms. And as new monarchs rose, they too found use in her presence. When Edward's advisors sought German alliances, they turned to Anne for insight into Lutheran courts. When Mary restored Catholic ritual, she still visited Anne, not out of religious unity, but out of respect. Anne did not debate theology. She spoke only of stability, of peace, of what England might become if it stopped feeding on its own daughters. And when Elizabeth ascended the throne in the year 1558, Anne was already gone, but her memory lingered, not in gold-framed portraits, but in the quiet habits she had left behind. At Chelsea, she kept her routine until the end. She rose before the servants. She sat by the window with a cup of spiced broth. She reread letters from her brother Wilhelm. She visited her gardens and commented on the growth of the herbs. In the afternoons, she embroidered, or read, or hosted guests with warm bread and honeyed wine. In the evenings, she prayed not aloud, not for show, but with the quiet intimacy of a woman who had long made her peace with the world. And when the illness came, it came gently. There was no sudden collapse, no bloody fever, just a slowing, a heaviness in the breath, a dimming of the light behind the eyes. She took to her bed, not in fear, but in preparation. She spoke little. She asked for nothing but calm. And on a mild summer evening in the year 1557, surrounded by her household and attended by the chaplain she had chosen, Anne of Cleves died. There was no fanfare, no royal mourning period, but those who knew her felt it deeply. At her funeral in Westminster Abbey, Nobles gathered not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The Lady Mary, now Queen Mary, ensured that her burial carried the dignity of her station. She was not buried beside Henry. She was not laid with the queens. But her tomb bore her name plainly. No shame, nor denial, just Anna Regina, a quiet declaration that, for a time, she had held the crown, and more importantly, that she had laid it down with grace. Her possessions, inventoried with care, revealed the shape of a life lived richly, not in opulence, but in meaning. Books in Latin, German, English, letters from dukes and daughters, painted miniatures of nieces she had never met, embroidered cushions she had made by hand, a simple cross she had worn every morning, a German psalter, stained at the corners from daily use. She left no children, no dynastic legacy, but she left a blueprint for survival. A woman discarded became a woman respected. A queen dethroned became a matriarch with no crown. No husband, no heir, but a life carved carefully from the wreckage of power. She had once been mocked for not arousing a king's desire. Now, she was remembered for arousing no one's hatred. And in Tudor England, that was a miracle. They had tried to erase her first with silence, then with shame, then with forgetfulness, but they could not. She had outlasted them, outlived them, outgrown them. Anne of Cleves was the wife Henry could not touch. The Queen England never quite claimed, and the matriarch history never forgot. And as the sun set over the Thames, the bells of Chelsea rang not for tragedy, but for the quiet end of a woman who had written her story not in ink, but in endurance. So now the tale softens. The voices grow quiet. The court has long emptied. The king is dead. The daughters have ruled and passed into shadow. The war banners have faded. The ink has dried, and somewhere beneath the pale sky of England, the woman they once called the Mare of Flanders, the queen who never was, the bride the king refused to touch, sleeps. Her name was Anne of Cleves, and she lived. That, in the end, is the most remarkable part. Not the marriage, not the scandal, not the annulment inked in silence and humiliation, not the jokes whispered behind fans or the physicians who studied her like a puzzle they had been ordered to solve, not the portrait, not the bedroom left untouched, not the king's frown or the court's sneer. No, what matters now, long after the courtiers are bones in forgotten vaults, is that she remained when the others fell. She outlasted Henry. She outlasted Cromwell, whose cleverness had not saved him. She outlasted Catherine Howard, whose beauty could not protect her. She outlasted the sword, the stain, the cruelty that dressed itself in ermine. She outlasted the system that had tried to reduce her to a footnote in a man's chronicle, and she did not do it with war, nor with rebellion, nor with fire. She did it with silence, and stillness, and survival. She stepped back, not out of weakness, but out of wisdom. She saw the blade where others saw the throne. She traded power for peace. She gave up the title of queen to wear something far rarer, a life of her own choosing. In an age when queens were crushed by the weight of their crowns, Anne of Cleves found freedom in setting hers down. She never ruled a realm, but she ruled herself. She was never worshipped, but she was respected. She had no heir, but she left behind a legacy, not one etched in royal bloodlines, but one carried in quiet revolutions in gardens, in ledgers, in the letters she wrote, and the girls she educated, and the peace she created around her like a cloister. She found power where no one thought to look for it. In charity, in thought, in walking away, and what is more radical than that, the court had tried to shame her, to turn her into a punchline in a history written by men who only valued beauty and obedience. But time, relentless time, has undone their cruelty. It is not Henry's lust that we remember now, nor the courtiers who laughed, nor the men who whispered about her body like vultures circling over a feast. It is Anne we remember, not as failure, not as conquest, but as victory and stillness. She was not a victim of her story. She was the author of its ending. And so now, centuries later, we do not weep for her. We thank her for reminding us that dignity can outlive gossip, that endurance is a quiet kind of royalty, that a woman need not be desired to be remembered, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a world built to consume you is to simply walk away and survive. Anne of Cleves closed her eyes in the year 1557. She had no crowd to cheer her, no banners waving in the wind, just soft footsteps in the hallway, a candle guttering low, and the whisper of linen as she folded her hands across her chest and slipped peacefully into history. No axe, no exile, no tragedy, only rest. And now, may she rest well, the queen who outlived the king. Good night. Anne, you were never forgotten. You were simply ahead of your time.